not really a student of religion in the more narrow sense, so my interest in religion comes from my broader interest in politics. So what I will briefly sketch for you today is actually nothing that has to do with Lithuanian politics, I'm sorry, but it's some general ideas how anthropologists and other social scientists have tried to re-theorize the role of religion in connection with this amorphous thing called neoliberalism, or forms of neoliberal governance, let's put it this way. And this can, of course, be transferred to post-Soviet Lithuania and other parts of the world, but I will not really go into detail concerning any local politics this time, not before the elections. And what I see as an interesting concept that can help us maybe to theorize politics under neoliberalism is this idea of the post-political or of post-democracy, which signals a shift in focus away from political institutions or institutionalized politics toward more informal processes of negotiating power relations. And framed in these terms, it's actually something which looks quite familiar to the anthropologist. Post-politics is, of course, not, or the idea of the post-political is not an anthropological concept. It's been debated, raised, whatever, created, discussed by a lot of what you might call post-Marxist political philosophers, people like Rancière, Badiou, Zizek, Schröder, and they have claimed that what is really dominating in contemporary society is a politics of consensus, which is based on the systematic foreclosure of the properly political dimension. So new governmental techniques reduce politics proper to social administration, and this is linked to a postmodernist politics of the self, which tends to replace political values by moral values. I don't want to go into detail concerning these philosophical discussions. There's one major effort made by social scientists to incorporate this idea of the post-political into his ideas, and that's the Belgian, I think it is, geographer Erik Šrioderio, who teaches in Britain, and who's written a couple of articles where he discusses this concept of a post-political. And he just has a couple of nice quotes that I could throw at you just to give you an idea how the post-political has been described. So as a kind of a definition, he says that under post-political conditions, the political is being replaced by, quote, a consensual mode of governance that has apparently reduced political conflict and disagreement to either an ultra-politics of radical and violent disavowal, exclusion and containment, or to a para-political inclusion of different opinions on everything imaginable in arrangements of impotent participation in consensual good techno-managerial governance. So I think the second is probably the really interesting part, that politics in contemporary society is not really imagined to be about debate of groups, people, positions representing opposite interests or representing specific constituencies, but what really is seen as a criteria of good governance is what Don Culp has so nicely termed the unstoppable rule of experts. It's a certain expertise which is important, and the ability to govern successfully is very often expressed in these terms that this is the only possible logical way to go. There was this famous quote attributed to Margaret Thatcher, "There's no alternative," and we have very similar quotes from our German Chancellor. So there's the idea that politics is something, making politics is just making what is necessary. And Šrioderio and others have argued that actually the history of the post-political started after the end of the contentious 1960s, when the left critique of capitalism became incorporated and depoliticized in what the French sociologist Vytauto has called a new spirit of capitalism, which already reacted to the critique of the radical left in the 60s. And later, the political equality was weakened as a central concern, and democracy became pursued as the freedom to exercise individual choice and preferences. There's again this famous distinction made by philosopher Nancy Fraser, who argued that after the 60s, claims to redistributing wealth in society was being replaced by claims to recognition that individual identities were supposed to be recognized by the state or by the public, and this was the most important goal that people who were criticizing the state were pursuing. So without going into more detail concerning the post-political, the question that I'm interested in and that other anthropologists have been the last couple of years been thinking about is how do these new forms of government, if you call them post-political or neoliberal, whatever, how do they exactly give rise maybe to a specific theoretical understanding of the role of religion? And there has been a couple of suggestions, one made by Don Kalp, who I already mentioned, who's a Dutch anthropologist teaching at CEU, done a lot of research on Eastern Europe, and recently wrote a rather interesting article on contemporary populism in Eastern Europe. And he argues that one aspect of this rise of these new forms of working class populism, as he called it, is the link between nation and religion. So this would be one suggestion how religion could be brought into play. Another suggestion comes more from the side of political science, arguing with the concept of hegemony, going back to Gramsci, and basically can be roughly defined as a mode of political dominance under conditions of capitalism that is based on consensus and compromise, or let's say it's based also on consensus and compromise. And so political scientists have argued that currently there's, we are watching kind of a weakening of the neoliberal hegemony. So we have a situation where the state is no longer able to offer enough to the population to support the hegemonic situation. And so for that, the hegemonic constellation, for that reason, hegemony fails to attain that integrative quality which is required for its long-term stability, and for this reason becomes increasingly susceptible to crises. And one additional strategy, or new strategy of creating meaning under such conditions, creating support for the neoliberal hegemonic project, could be the role of churches in society. So that would be some rather broad arguments how this link could be seen, and getting closer to the end, I will say a little bit more about two specifically anthropological efforts that try to link religion and neoliberal governance. One is by one of the big names in American anthropology Komarov, who has recently published an article where he theorizes the role of faith, especially of the charismatic Pentecostal type in her case, studying mostly Pentecostal charismatic churches in Southern Africa under the regime of global neoliberalism. Such religions, charismatic Pentecostal Christianity, which are in fundamental tension with the modernist project, have been growing in salience throughout the world and are posing a major challenge to the classical secularization paradigm. They aim to counter the institutional arrangements of modern ontologies and nation-states. As under conditions of neoliberal deregulation, states relinquish their responsibility for many areas of the social reproduction of citizens, schooling, healthcare, welfare provision, etc., religious organizations are reclaiming this role and making a vital place for themselves in the world of politics, the market, and mass communication. In other words, Komarov suggests that certain forms, at least, of contemporary religion are integral to the present-day stage in the life of capital, insofar as they respond to a quest for fundamental certainties, authoritarian truths, and absolute sovereignties. More specifically, she identifies three dimensions of the relationship between religion and secularism, or between the role of religion under these specific neoliberal conditions. First is the sociological dimension. Faiths tend to take the form of theocracies to embrace an ever wider array of one's secular activities and regulatory functions as part of a quest for the total reclamation of the social sphere. Secondly, the ontological dimension. Faith strives to counter relativism and a crisis of meaning by offering cogent orders of fixed reference and absolute truths. And thirdly, the pragmatic dimension, as she called it. Faiths tend to mimic the creative forms of the market, promising to unlock unprecedented sources of value and productivity by tapping into the direct operation of God in the world. And the second and final example comes from I think she's Swiss, but currently based at the University of Toronto in Canada, anthropologist Andrea Mühlebach, who wrote a dissertation which has recently been turned into a book called The Moral Neoliberal, on this link of moral aspirations of citizens and neoliberal governance in Italy, and specifically focuses on the central figure of the volunteer. And she argues that people who do volunteer work under neoliberal regimes in many cases are exactly those who oppose the core value of neoliberalism, maybe, for example, espousing Christian values, and for that reason take over the work that the neoliberal state is no longer doing in helping those people in need in society. But if you look at it from another angle, by doing this, they exactly serve to reproduce these politics of neoliberalism by supporting the system in which the state retreats from public obligations and tries to outsource them to the public and exactly to these volunteers. And so we have what we call the moral economy of neoliberalism, where religious values, but also, of course, other values of liberal-minded individuals are very closely entangled with the maintenance of the neoliberal system, although the people who are actually involved in these activities probably have something very different in mind than supporting the neoliberal state. So these are two examples of how anthropologists have tried to research the specific, theorize in the case of Jean Komarov, and study specifically, ethnographically in the case of Andrea Mühlebach, the role of religion in neoliberal societies. And I'll probably stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.